I was a nanny they refused to pay, and as I stood in their marble foyer holding my final invoice, 3 months overdue, watching Margaret Whitmore's perfectly manicured fingers wave dismissively at the papers in my hand, I knew this wasn't going to end the way they thought. The weight of that moment pressed against my chest like a stone. 3 months of caring for their twin boys, Lucas and Mason, aged 4 and 6. 3 months of arriving at 7 in the morning to their sprawling Tudor estate in Riverside's most exclusive neighborhood. 3 months of preparing organic meals, managing tantrums, coordinating playdates, and staying late when Margaret's wine-soaked book club meetings ran long or when Richard's business dinners kept him in the city past midnight. 3 months of watching them spend more on a single dinner out than they owed me in wages. Margaret's lips curved into that practiced smile she reserved for dismissing service staff. Her eyes didn't meet mine as she turned toward the kitchen, her Louboutin heels clicking against the Italian marble. The sound echoed through the 2-story entryway, bouncing off the crystal chandelier that cost more than most people's cars. Behind her, Richard emerged from his home office, phone pressed to his ear. His gestures were animated, aggressive, the kind of body language that suggested significant money was being discussed. He glanced at me, then at the papers in my hand, and I watched his expression shift from mild annoyance to something harder. More calculating. His conversation ended abruptly. The phone snapped shut with a sharp click that seemed to punctuate the silence. Margaret's voice drifted from the kitchen, casual and dismissive, as if discussing the weather. Something about cash flow and temporary setbacks. About how domestic help needed to understand the realities of running a household. About how good help was hard to find, but patience was a virtue. Richard's nod was barely perceptible, but I caught it. The slight tilt of his head toward the door. The way his eyes fixed on a point just past my shoulder rather than on my face. I'd seen that look before. 3 months ago when they'd hired me. That same calculating assessment, as if I were a piece of equipment being evaluated for purchase. Useful but ultimately disposable. The boys appeared at the top of the curved staircase, still in their pajamas despite it being nearly 9 in the morning. Lucas, the younger one, started down the steps, but Margaret's sharp whistle stopped him mid-stride, a sound she'd make to call a dog. He retreated immediately, Mason's hand on his shoulder, both of them disappearing into the upstairs hallway like ghosts. They'd grown attached to me over the months. I'd seen it in the way Lucas would run to me when he scraped his knee, in how Mason would save his artwork to show me first. I'd watched them flourish under consistent care, their behavior improving as they adapted to structure and genuine attention. But that wasn't my concern anymore. Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and I watched his jaw tighten. Whatever he saw, there wasn't good news. His thumb moved across the screen rapidly, typing a response, and when he looked up, his expression had shifted again. Sharper, more urgent. Margaret returned from the kitchen, a coffee cup in her hand. Steam rose from the ceramic, carrying the scent of their expensive blend. She took a slow sip, studying me over the rim as if I were an interesting specimen. Her wedding ring, a 5-carat monstrosity that caught the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, clinked against the cup as she set it down on the marble-topped console table. The sound was delicate, almost musical, a stark contrast to the weight of the silence that followed. I folded the invoice carefully, precisely, and slipped it into my purse. The leather was worn, practical, a sharp contrast to Margaret's collection of designer handbags that lined the closet in their master suite. I'd seen them during my cleaning duties, dozens of them, each worth more than what they owed me. Richard cleared his throat. A sound meant to signal the end of our interaction. His hand moved toward his wallet, then stopped. His eyes met Margaret's, and some unspoken communication passed between them. The wallet disappeared back into his pocket. Margaret's smile widened, becoming more predatory. Her head tilted slightly, and she gestured toward the door with the casual air of someone dismissing a delivery person. I turned to leave, but paused at the threshold. The morning sun streamed through the beveled glass panels, casting prismatic patterns across the marble floor. Beautiful but cold, like everything else in this house. Behind me, I heard Richard's phone ring again. His voice, when he answered, carried the forced joviality of someone trying to project confidence they didn't feel. Words like temporary, and cash flow, and investment opportunity drifted through the foyer. The door closed behind me with a soft click, but I didn't immediately move toward my car. Instead, I stood on their front steps, breathing in the morning air, feeling the weight of realization settle into my bones. This wasn't about the money, not really. This was about power. about people who believed that their wealth granted them the right to use others without consequence, about the casual cruelty of dismissing someone's labor as worthless, their time as irrelevant, their dignity as negotiable. I'd seen it in their interactions with everyone who served them. The housekeeper who came twice a week always paid late. The gardener who'd stopped showing up last month after apparently going unpaid for weeks. The various contractors and service providers who'd learned to demand payment up front. But I'd also seen something else during my time in their house. Something they probably didn't realize I'd noticed. The way Richard's late-night phone calls involved numbers that didn't match the tax documents I'd glimpsed on his desk. The way Margaret's shopping receipts, scattered carelessly around the house, were systematically collected and organized in ways that suggested they served a purpose beyond mere record-keeping. The way their housekeeper Rosa had whispered to me in Spanish about the cash payments she received, payments that came with explicit instructions never to report them. I'd filed these observations away without thinking much of them at the time. Rich people had accountants and financial advisors. Their money management was none of my business. But standing on their front steps, feeling the sting of their casual dismissal, those observations began to coalesce into something more significant. During my 3 months in their house, I'd been more than a nanny. I'd been invisible help, the kind of person who becomes background noise in a wealthy household. I'd overheard phone calls, seen documents, witnessed interactions that painted a picture of how the Whitmores really managed their finances. And that picture was very, very interesting. My car started on the second try, a temperamental old Honda that had served me faithfully for the past decade. As I drove away from their estate, I caught sight of Margaret in the rearview mirror. She stood at one of the front windows, coffee cup in hand, watching me leave with the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully avoided an unpleasant obligation. The drive home took me through the heart of Riverside, past the manicured lawns and iron gates that separated the wealthy from everyone else. At a red light, I found myself studying the faces of other drivers, wondering how many of them had been dismissed, used, or discarded by people who believed money granted them immunity from basic human decency. My apartment was a 30-minute drive from the Whitmores' estate, in a neighborhood where the houses were smaller, older, and infinitely more honest. No marble foyers or crystal chandeliers, but also no casual cruelty or entitled dismissal of people's worth. I climbed the stairs to my second-floor unit, keys jingling in my hand. The sound echoed in the narrow hallway, a stark contrast to the hushed luxury of the Whitmore house. Inside, I made coffee in my small kitchen, using a basic machine that had cost me $30 5 years ago. The brew was strong, bitter, and perfect. I sat at my small dining table, opened my laptop, and began to type. Not an angry letter or a social media rant. Nothing that would provide them with emotional satisfaction or give them grounds to dismiss me as unstable. Instead, I opened a new document and began to reconstruct everything I'd observed during my 3 months in their house. Richard's phone calls, the ones that happened late at night when he thought no one was listening. The numbers he'd discussed, income figures that seemed to fluctuate depending on who he was talking to. Margaret's shopping habits. The way she'd return from spending sprees with designer bags full of receipts, then spend hours organizing them in her home office. The way she'd mutter about deductible and business expense, while categorizing purchases that seemed entirely personal. The cash payments to Rosa. The explicit instructions about not reporting them. The way similar arrangements seemed to exist with other service providers. The home office I'd cleaned every week, where documents were left scattered across Richard's desk. Bank statements, investment portfolios, and tax documents that told a story of income and expenses that didn't quite add up. I typed for 3 hours, my fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. Each memory was cataloged, dated, and cross-referenced. The picture that emerged was one of systematic tax fraud, a carefully constructed network of unreported income and fraudulent deductions. But documentation wasn't enough. I needed proof, and I knew exactly where to find it. The next morning, I called Margaret's cell phone. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice carrying the slight breathlessness of someone who'd been caught off guard. I kept my voice steady, professional. I explained that I'd left some personal items in the house during my hasty departure yesterday. Would it be possible to retrieve them? There was a pause. I could hear her considering, weighing the inconvenience against the potential trouble of refusing. Her response when it came was clipped but agreeable. I could come by that afternoon. She'd be out, but Rosa would be there to let me in. Perfect. Rosa greeted me at the door with a warm smile and a gentle pat on my arm. Her English was limited, but her kindness was universal. She'd always been grateful for my help with the boys, and I'd always treated her with the respect the Whitmores failed to show. She led me upstairs to the room I'd designated as my base of operations during my employment, a small guest room where I'd kept a change of clothes and some basic supplies. I made a show of collecting items from the dresser and closet, chatting with Rosa in my broken Spanish about the boys and how much I'd missed them. But my real objective was the home office down the hall. 20 minutes into my visit, Rosa's phone rang. She excused herself, heading downstairs to answer. I waited until I heard her voice from the kitchen, then slipped out of the guest room and down the hallway. Richard's office was exactly as I'd left it the previous week. Documents scattered across his desk, filing cabinets unlocked, computer in sleep mode but not shut down. I had maybe 10 minutes before Rosa would come looking for me. I started with the desk, photographing everything with my phone. Bank statements showing large cash deposits that didn't correspond to any legitimate business income. Investment documents revealing offshore accounts that weren't declared on tax returns. Receipts for personal expenses that had been categorized as business deductions. The filing cabinets were a goldmine. Folders labeled deductions. And cash flow contained evidence of systematic fraud spanning multiple years. Personal vacation expenses claimed as business trips. Luxury purchases for the house categorized as office equipment. Even the boys' private school tuition had been creatively reclassified as educational consulting fees. My phone's camera worked overtime, capturing page after page of evidence. The scope of their fraud was breathtaking. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in unreported income, fraudulent deductions that reduced their tax liability to almost nothing. But the real treasure was in the computer. Richard's email was still open, displaying correspondence with his accountant. The messages were explicit, discussing strategies for hiding income and maximizing deductions through questionable means. One thread from the previous month detailed a scheme to classify their housekeepers' wages as consulting fees to avoid employment taxes. Another email chain discussed the benefits of paying service providers in cash to avoid creating paper trails. Rosa's name appeared multiple times, along with references to other domestic workers who'd been paid under the table. I photographed everything, my heart racing as I heard Rosa's footsteps on the stairs. She was coming back up. I closed the email program, ensured the computer returned to sleep mode, and slipped out of the office just as Rosa appeared at the top of the stairs. She smiled at me, gesturing toward the guest room with a questioning look. I nodded, pointing to the small bag I'd packed with my supposed personal items. She accompanied me downstairs, chatting about how quiet the house felt without the boys' laughter. At the door, she pressed a small envelope into my hands. Inside was a handwritten note in Spanish, along with a $20 bill. The note, as best I could translate, was an apology for what had happened and a wish for my future success. Rosa's kindness stood in stark contrast to her employer's cruelty. She was as much a victim of their system as I was, perhaps more so. Her undocumented status made her vulnerable to their exploitation, unable to report the cash payments that violated employment law. I thanked her warmly, promising to stay in touch. As I drove away, I felt the weight of the evidence on my phone, hundreds of photographs that told the story of systematic tax fraud. But I wasn't ready to act yet. The IRS was a powerful adversary, but they were also bureaucratic and slow. I needed to ensure my report was comprehensive, unassailable, and devastating. I needed to document not just the fraud, but the pattern of behavior that made it possible. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a forensic accountant. I cross-referenced the photographs with public records, tax databases, and business filings. I researched the Whitmores' claimed income against their visible lifestyle, documenting the mathematical impossibility of maintaining their standard of living on their reported earnings. I discovered that Richard's consulting business, the source of much of his claimed income, had no visible clients, no office space, and no employees other than himself. Yet it generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue each year, all conveniently difficult to verify. Margaret's interior design business was similarly fictitious. She claimed significant income from decorating services, but had no portfolio, no website, and no verifiable clients. The business existed only on paper, a vehicle for converting personal expenses into tax deductions. Their charitable donations were equally suspect. Large contributions to organizations that seemed to exist only to provide tax benefits, with no actual charitable work being performed. The deeper I dug, the more extensive the fraud became. This wasn't just tax avoidance. It was a comprehensive system of tax evasion that had been operating for years. But the investigation revealed something else, something that made their refusal to pay me even more egregious. They weren't struggling financially. They weren't experiencing cash flow problems. They were simply greedy, unwilling to pay for services they'd already received because they believed they could get away with it. Their bank statements showed consistent large deposits, investment income, and cash reserves that dwarfed what they owed me. The money was there. They just chose not to pay. This realization transformed my anger into something colder, more focused. This wasn't about recovering my wages. It was about justice. I spent another week crafting my report to the IRS. The document was 47 pages long, meticulously detailed and thoroughly documented. I included every photograph, every cross-reference, every piece of evidence that demonstrated the scope and duration of their fraud. But I also included something else, a detailed timeline of my employment, the services I'd provided, and their refusal to pay my wages. I documented how their treatment of domestic workers was part of a larger pattern of tax evasion, how their exploitation of vulnerable employees served their broader criminal enterprise. The report painted a picture of systematic criminal behavior, not just isolated incidents of tax avoidance. Before submitting the report, I made copies of everything. Digital copies stored in multiple locations, physical copies locked in a safe deposit box. I created a comprehensive backup of every piece of evidence, every document, every photograph. Then I waited. The IRS moved slowly, but they moved thoroughly. I knew it would be months before I saw any visible results from my report, but I also knew that once the investigation began, it would be relentless. In the meantime, I found a new position with a family in a neighboring town. The Johnsons were middle class, honest, and treated their nanny with respect and fair compensation. The contrast with the Whitmores was stark and refreshing. But I never forgot about the report I'd filed, the wheels I'd set in motion. 3 months after submitting my documentation to the IRS, I received my first indication that the investigation was underway. A certified letter arrived at my apartment, requesting that I contact an IRS investigator regarding information you may have provided to our office. Agent Sarah Chen was professional, thorough, and clearly impressed by the quality of my documentation. Our initial phone conversation lasted over an hour, during which she asked detailed questions about my observations, my access to the Whitmores' financial documents, and my interactions with other employees. She was particularly interested in Rosa and the cash payment system. I provided her with Rosa's contact information, along with details about other service providers who'd been paid under similar arrangements. 2 weeks later, Agent Chen called again. The IRS had obtained warrants for the Whitmores' financial records, and my documentation had been instrumental in securing judicial approval for the investigation. The audit was officially underway, but I still hadn't heard from the Whitmores directly. They had no idea that their financial lives were being dissected by federal investigators, that their years of fraud were being systematically documented and cataloged. That changed on a Tuesday morning in November. I was at the Johnsons' house helping their daughter with homework when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Margaret Whitmore's number. I let it go to voicemail. She called again 20 minutes later, then again an hour after that. Finally, I listened to her messages. Her voice was different, higher, more strained. The casual dismissiveness was gone, replaced by something that sounded like barely controlled panic. The first message was a request for me to call her back. Something about a misunderstanding regarding my employment. The second message was more urgent. References to resolving this matter and coming to an agreement. The third message was desperate. Mentions of complications and needing to talk immediately. I didn't call back. Instead, I called Agent Chen and reported the contact. She listened carefully, then advised me to document any future communications but not to respond directly. The Whitmores had clearly been contacted by the IRS. The investigation was no longer secret, and they were beginning to understand the scope of their problem. But they still didn't know the source of the information that had triggered the audit. That revelation came 2 weeks later. I was grocery shopping when I saw Margaret in the produce section. She looked different, thinner, more haggard. Her usual perfect composure was cracked, replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. For For a second, we both froze, separated by a display of apples and the weight of unspoken knowledge. Then she approached. Her voice when she spoke was carefully controlled. She asked about my new job, my new family, whether I was happy with my situation. I responded politely, professionally. Yes, I was doing well. Yes, my new employers were wonderful. Yes, I was much happier. She nodded, processing my words carefully. Then she moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. She mentioned that she and Richard had been dealing with some tax complications. Nothing serious, just some paperwork issues that needed to be resolved. She wondered if, during my time in their house, I might have inadvertently seen or heard something that could have been misinterpreted. I met her eyes directly. My expression was neutral, curious. I had no idea what she was talking about. Her composure cracked slightly. She mentioned the IRS investigation more explicitly, explaining that someone had provided information that led to questions about their financial practices. She was sure it was all a misunderstanding, but the investigators seemed very thorough. I expressed appropriate sympathy for her situation while maintaining my ignorance about the specifics. She studied my face, searching for any sign of deception. I gave her nothing. Before leaving, she mentioned that they'd finally resolved their cash flow issues. If I was ever interested in returning to work for them, they would be happy to pay all outstanding wages immediately. I thanked her for the offer but explained that I was committed to my current family. She nodded, disappointed but not surprised. As she walked away, I saw her shoulders slump slightly, the posture of someone carrying a heavy burden. I finished my shopping and drove home, my mind racing with the implications of our encounter. The IRS investigation was clearly progressing, and the Whitmores were beginning to understand the severity of their situation. But they still didn't know who had provided the information. That anonymity was important. It allowed me to observe their growing desperation without becoming a direct target of their anger or attempts at manipulation. Over the following months, I watched their situation deteriorate from a distance. Richard's consulting business was shuttered after the IRS determined it was fraudulent. Margaret's interior design company faced similar scrutiny. Their joint tax returns for the previous 5 years were being audited, with penalties and interest accumulating daily. The investigation expanded to include criminal charges. Tax evasion on the scale they'd practiced wasn't just a civil matter, it was a federal crime. Through Agent Chen, I learned that other victims had come forward. Rosa and several other domestic workers had provided testimony about the cash payment schemes. Contractors and service providers had documented their experiences with the Whitmores' exploitative practices. The case was building into something much larger than a simple tax audit. But the most satisfying development came 8 months after I'd filed my initial report. I was driving through their neighborhood when I saw the vehicles in their driveway. Official cars with government plates, agents in suits carrying boxes of documents out of the house. The raid was happening. I parked across the street and watched as federal agents systematically removed evidence from the Whitmore home. Computers, filing cabinets, boxes of documents, everything I'd photographed months earlier was being officially confiscated. Margaret stood on the front steps, watching helplessly as her carefully constructed life was dissected by federal investigators. Richard was nowhere to be seen. I learned later that he'd been arrested at his office earlier that morning. The boys weren't there either. I hoped they were staying with relatives, shielded from the immediate chaos of their parents' downfall. But what struck me most was Margaret's expression. The entitled confidence was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed realization that her world was collapsing around her. She no longer looked like someone who believed she could dismiss people without consequence. The trial began 18 months later. By then, the case had expanded to include charges of tax evasion, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The prosecution's evidence was overwhelming, built on the foundation of documentation I'd provided, but expanded through additional investigation and witness testimony. I attended the trial as a witness, testifying about my observations during my employment with the Whitmores. My testimony was clinical, factual, and devastating. I described the documents I'd seen, the conversations I'd overheard, the systematic exploitation of domestic workers. I explained how their refusal to pay my wages was part of a broader pattern of criminal behavior. Margaret and Richard sat at the defense table, their expensive lawyers flanking them. But no amount of legal expertise could overcome the weight of evidence against them. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Richard received a sentence of 7 years in federal prison, plus restitution and penalties totaling over $2 million. Margaret received 5 years with similar financial penalties. Their house was seized to satisfy their tax debt. Their assets were frozen, their lifestyle destroyed. But the most satisfying moment came after the sentencing, as I walked out of the courthouse. Margaret was being led away in handcuffs, but she turned to look at me. For the first time since that morning in their foyer, our eyes met directly. In that moment, she knew. She understood who had provided the information that brought down their criminal enterprise. She realized that the nanny they'd dismissed so casually had been their undoing. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply met her gaze with the same professional neutrality I'd maintained throughout our entire relationship. But in that look, I conveyed everything she needed to understand. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It wasn't about anger. It was about accountability. She'd treated me as disposable, but I'd proven that every person has value, every worker deserves respect, and every criminal action has consequences. As she was led away, I thought about the boys. They were staying with Margaret's sister, enrolled in public school, adjusting to a life without marble foyers and crystal chandeliers. It would be difficult for them, but perhaps they'd learn lessons their parents never had about treating people with dignity. I thought about Rosa, who'd found new employment with a family who paid her fairly and respected her contributions. The IRS investigation had helped her regularize her status, and she was no longer vulnerable to exploitation. I thought about the other domestic workers who'd been empowered to come forward, who'd learned that their voices mattered and their rights were protected. And I thought about myself, standing in that courthouse, knowing that justice had been served not through anger or vengeance, but through patience, documentation, and the systematic application of the law. The nanny they'd refused to pay had become the architect of their downfall. The woman they'd dismissed had dismantled their criminal enterprise with surgical precision. I walked out of that courthouse into the afternoon sunlight, my head held high, knowing that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply ensuring that criminals face the consequences of their actions. The Whitmores had learned, finally, that every person they'd exploited had value, even the nanny they'd thought they could dismiss without consequence, especially her.